There are two different types of behavior, or broader areas of behavior, called either innate behavior, and that's kind of instinctive behavior, so instinctive behavior, or learned behavior. So that's something that we have to learn over time. So as we grow older, or as we do something more, we learn it. Example of learned behavior would be your actual traffic light, right? So when you're driving, and this is meant to be a car, when you're driving and you see red, you tend to, or you're meant to stop, right? So you kind of know you're meant to stop, so you stop the car, hopefully, right? When it's green, you know you're meant to go. All this is learned behavior. You don't just know it, you kind of need to learn this behavior. Whereas, for example, if you're a little kid, a little baby, and this is meant to be a little baby, again, my drawing skills aren't very good, but let's say you have loud sound coming. This is meant to be loud sound. This loud sound will go into the child's ear, and this child will either cry or be upset because of that loud sound. Now that's innate behavior, that's instinctive behavior, that's some behavior that the kid just knows is meant to be doing, right? It doesn't have to be told, okay, there's loud sound, please cry. It's going to be doing it because it knows instinctively that loud sound is not good for it. Right, so these are two examples of behavior, and the reason why I mention all this is because the dot point says explain, using specific examples, the importance of a correct interpretation of sensory signals by the brain for the coordination of animal behavior. So we just talked about different types of behavior. We've got the kind of reflexive or instinctive behavior, and we've got the learned behavior. And what this dot point is asking us to do is asking us to talk about the importance of correct interpretation of sensory signals so the brain can coordinate these behaviors properly, right? So, for example, we often have, the sensory neurons, or these are the receptors. They have to be sent by interneurons that connect sensory neurons to the brain, and then the signal gets sent to the brain, and the brain sends a signal back, and you get a motor neuron that will activate a muscle, right? So you often have these different steps that need to be taking place for there to be a behavior, right? We need to have a signal. The signal needs to be sent to our brain. The brain needs to know what to do with it, and we often have an action happen. So, for example, a reflex arc. The reflex arc doesn't actually involve the brain; it involves the spinal cord. But we have a sensory signal being picked up by the receptor, right? So this is meant to be a hand. Again, my drawing skills are not too good, but it's meant to be a hand. You've got a sensory receptor here. This would be maybe a heat receptor. We've got a flame here. Again, this is meant to be a flame. You've got a flame close to the hand. A signal will be sent towards the spinal cord. The spinal cord will decide what to do. It's interpreting the message, and then it's sending a signal back to the muscle or a motor neuron, and hopefully you will remove your hand, right? So that's the idea of a reflex. When it comes to vision, for example, again, obviously when it comes to the sight, these different colors of the actual traffic light, we need to be able to see something, right? So we need to be able to have these sensory neurons, the sensory signals being picked up by our eye. That signal gets into our brain. It gets interpreted there at the occipital lobe of the brain, and then we know what to do, right? So then our muscles might be activated. If it's red, then the muscles of our feet that are put themselves on the brake will be activated, and the car stops. So for us to be able to stop the car, we need to be able to pick up the signal, but also our brain needs to be able to interpret it correctly. So our occipital part of our brain needs to be working properly as well, right? Another example would be walking, right? So walking, again, remember which part of the brain is responsible for walking. That would be the cerebellum. Cerebellum is there for motor control or motor coordination. Now, walking is a pretty sort of straightforward process. We don't have to think about it much. But at the same time, we have to have sensory neurons in our skin for posture and everything else involved. We have to send that signal to the brain. The brain needs to send signal back to different muscles to make sure that we can all walk properly, right? So if there is a problem at any part here, that means the whole system collapses and the behavior doesn't happen, right? The behavior will be walking. We can walk. We know how to walk. We might want to walk to a different shop or whatever else. But if there's a problem with any of this part in terms of the chain, then walking will stop. The behavior will stop. So we need to give a specific example as well, and that's what I'll do as well. But just remember, we've got the brain and we've got the spinal cord, and these two are part of the central nervous system, and they are responsible for more or less relaying message from one part to the next. And without this part, without these parts being active and fully functional, we have a problem. We have a problem in our ability to act out on certain impulses or stimuli. Alright, so I'm going to two examples of the importance of interpretation, correct interpretation. Remember, the obvious importance of correct interpretation is the fact that without correct interpretation, we can't perform our normal task. Our normal behavior is not going to happen if we can't move our hands, if we can't see, and all that kind of stuff. So obviously, normal interpretation of signals to the brain is important, simply because all of our behavior relies on it. We need to be able to interpret and act on signals, and if there's any problem in the chain, we're going to have a problem. And these two are examples of conditions or problems that have caused a problem in that chain, right? So multiple sclerosis and aging are two conditions or two phenomenons that can cause a abrupt end to part of the chain, which can cause us to become less able to act on these signals. But other things would be, for example, if there's a lack of stimuli. What I mean by that is, for example, if you have the eyeball and you have the retina, which is where the photoreceptors are being activated, and then you obviously have that nerve, the optic nerve, that sends its signal to the brain, right? So usually we have the lens, for example, that will focus light on the back of the eye, and that light would be the stimuli. Right? But what happens, for example, if you have cataracts? Remember, cataracts was if you have a clouding of the lens, and that means that that signal doesn't either doesn't arrive at all, or arrives really badly and blurry. So if the stimulus itself doesn't arrive, that obviously means we have a problem when it comes to the coordination of our behavior, right? So if we are sitting at a traffic light and we have cataracts, really bad cataracts, which means we're blind, then we wouldn't be able to stop at the traffic light because we won't be able to see it. So lack of stimuli is a problem when it comes to coordination of behavior, because that means, for example, when it comes to lack of stimuli on light and stimuli, that means we're blind, and that means we can't act on traffic lights, as an example. Damaged neurons would be another example. This would be, for example, if you have damage to the brain itself for concussion, or maybe you'd have paralysis. You might have a stroke, which causes parts of your brain to be damaged, and that will obviously also cause problems when it comes to interpretation of signals. Right? If you have signals being sent to part of the brain that are meant to be dealing with, for example, sound or sight, but those parts are damaged, then they can't interpret it correctly. Then they won't be doing what they should be doing with those signals. Right? So damage to nerves is another example where you have problems when it comes to the correct interpretation of the brain. Now, drug and alcohol, these two are also really interesting examples. What drug and alcohol often does, it makes the membrane of neurons less permeable. Remember, permeable means how easy things can go in and out. So it makes the membrane less permeable to sodium. And remember the action potential. If sodium needs to be able to get into the cell for the action potential to happen, so the neurons will only be activated if the cells can actually allow sodium in. So if you're taking drugs and alcohol, some of our neurons won't be functioning properly because of that reason, because the action potential won't be happening. Right? So no action potential or less action potential when it comes to drugs and alcohol, because they make certain sodium channels less permeable, which means you have less coordinated movement. And you can see that if someone's drunk, he's kind of moving around like a crazy person, because his brain and other parts aren't working as they should be. So our signals aren't being interpreted as they should be. Right? Disease is another example where you might have a problem, and multiple sclerosis is one example, which I'll talk about in a second. And aging as well. Aging causes loss of neurons, which I'll talk about as well. So these two are the ones I'll go into a bit more detail. So multiple sclerosis, for example, is where is an autoimmune disease, which means our own body, so our own white blood cells, attack basically these myelin sheets. And if you've watched a couple of other videos, I've always been misspelling myelin sheets. I think I've always been saying myelin or myelin sheets. I don't know why. My brain sometimes doesn't interpret signals properly and just does random stuff. But obviously that's how you spell myelin sheets. But what happens here is your body actually attacks these myelin sheets. Remember, the function of these myelin sheets was to make sure that the signal doesn't escape, that it just gets sent straight through the actual axon. So when these myelin sheets are broken down, what that means is that signal doesn't get where it's meant to go. It's going to go sideways and out, and that means we can't conduct impulses towards the brain. If that happens in the brain or anywhere else, that means we're going to have a problem when it comes to the correct interpretation of sensory signals by the brain, right? And multiple sclerosis causes a loss of control of movement, causes weakness and blindness as well. And just a couple of things. I mean, it actually does more as well. But you can see these are all connected to bad interpretation of sensory signals because there's a problem with neurons, right? So multiple sclerosis was one specific examples, and the reason why I'm saying that is because it says use specific examples. The other example would be aging, and that's also with the loss of neurons, because as you age, you lose more neurons. That just happens. So for example, this is a young brain, so this might be, if you're doing your HSC, you will probably have a brain similar to this one. And if you're in your 70s and 80s, you might have a brain which looks a bit like this. You can see there is some mass loss. There are some neurons that have been damaged and destroyed. Neurons don't replicate themselves. They don't divide, which means if they die, they die. So obviously, if you've got a loss of neurons, that might mean that other parts of the brain don't work as well, right? So you need neurons to be able to function properly. So these loss of neurons can cause problems with the interpretation of signals. And we can see that because we've got memory loss, we've got coordination loss, and loss of thinking power. So that thinking power just means, logical thinking is sometimes not as good when you're 80 when compared to when you may be 20 or 30, right? So that's just examples of, those two examples would be examples of how you can use a specific example to show the importance of properly interpreting sensory signals by the brain, because in both those examples, there would be some problem with the interpretation of sensory signals, either in aging because we've lost some neurons, or in multiple sclerosis because these neurons have lost their myelin sheath, which means they become more or less useless. Both are examples where we lose control, we lose our ability to act on our normal behavior because of that actual disease, or in aging being not a disease, but just a condition. I hope that was useful.